September 1863. The war had been going on for 2 years now, and Millbrook County, Pennsylvania, felt like the edge of the world. Coal dust hung in the air like prayers that never reached heaven. The mountains pressed close on all sides, dark with pine and secrets. Most folks had already packed up and moved to the bigger towns where work was steady and the ground didn't shake from mining blasts. But some places, once they get their hooks in you, don't let go easy. Father Thomas McKenna pulled the wagon to a stop in front of St. Catherine's Cathedral. The horse snorted and stamped, nervous in the quiet. Behind him, 3 small faces peered out from under a patched canvas cover. Mary was 10, with hair the color of wheat and eyes that had seen too much. The boys, Samuel and James, were brothers, 8 and 6, who hadn't spoken much since the fire took their parents and the mission house where they'd all been living. The cathedral rose before them like a stone prayer, its twin spires reaching toward a sky the color of old pewter. But something was wrong with the picture. The great wooden doors stood slightly open, as if the building itself was holding its breath. No smoke came from the rectory chimney. No bells marked the hour, though Father Thomas knew it must be near evening. He climbed down from a wagon, his black robes heavy with dust from the long road. His boots echoed on the stone steps as he approached the doors. Behind him, he heard Mary whisper something to the boys, her voice small in the vast quiet. "Stay close," he called back to them, though his own voice seemed to disappear into the mountain air. The doors swung open with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside, the cathedral stretched away into shadows. Dust motes danced in the colored light from the stained glass windows, where saints looked down with faces touched by sunset. The pews stood empty, row after row, as if waiting for a congregation that would never come. Father Thomas's footsteps rang hollow on the stone floor as he walked down the center aisle. The children followed behind him like lost sheep, their small hands clutching each other. At the altar, he found what he had feared he might find: nothing. No priest, no caretaker. No sign that anyone had said Mass here in weeks, maybe months. On the altar, a single candle had burned down to nothing but wax pooled in a brass holder. The silence was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the soft breathing of the children behind him. "Father!" Mary's voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed to fill the entire space. "Where is everyone?" Thomas turned to look at her. In the colored light from the windows, she looked like one of the painted angels, fragile and otherworldly. The boys pressed close to her sides, their dark eyes wide and watchful. "I don't know, child," he said, and the honesty of it surprised him. He had planned to bring the children here to Father O'Malley, the old priest who had written to him about taking them in. The mission house had burned 3 weeks ago, taking everything they owned and most of the families who had sheltered there. These 3 were all that remained, and Thomas had nowhere else to take them. He walked to one of the front pews and sat down heavily. The wood was cold under his hands, smooth from years of faithful use. How many prayers had been whispered in this place? How many tears had fallen on these stones? And now it stood empty, abandoned like so much else in this valley that the world seemed eager to forget. Samuel, the younger boy, broke away from his sister and brother and walked to the altar. His small fingers traced the carved symbols on the stone, and Thomas watched him with growing unease. There was something in the boy's face, a recognition that didn't belong to a 6-year-old child. "The bells are broken," Samuel said, his voice carrying in the silence. It was the first time Thomas had heard him speak since the fire. "What did you say?" Thomas stood up, his heart beginning to pound. "The bells," Samuel repeated, pointing up toward the bell tower that rose above them, hidden in shadows. "They can't ring anymore. That's why it's so quiet." James took his little brother's hand and pulled him back toward Mary. "Sam knows things," he said simply, as if this explained everything. Thomas looked up toward the vaulted ceiling, toward the tower where the bells should have been marking the hours, calling the faithful to prayer. In the growing dusk, he could barely make out the wooden beams that supported the bell chamber. But Samuel was right. There was something wrong with the silence, something deeper than just the absence of people. The children were looking at him now, waiting. They had lost everything once already. They trusted him to keep them safe, to find them a home. But the world seemed to be shrinking around them, leaving fewer and fewer places where they could belong. Thomas made his decision in that moment, watching the colored light fade from the windows as night crept closer. He would not turn the wagon around. He would not take these children back out into a world that had no place for them. The cathedral was empty, yes, but it was shelter. It was sanctuary. And sometimes that was enough. "We'll stay here tonight," he said, his voice steady despite the doubt that gnawed at him. "Tomorrow we'll see about making this place a home." Mary's face brightened for the first time in weeks. "Really, Father? We can stay. For now," he said, though even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of them settling around his shoulders like a heavy cloak. This place wanted them to stay. He could feel it in the way the shadows seemed to welcome them, in the way the silence wrapped around them like protective arms. But protection from what? And at what cost? As darkness fell outside the stained glass windows, Thomas gathered the children close and led them toward what he hoped would be the priest's quarters. Their footsteps echoed in the emptiness, and somewhere high above them, in the bell tower where Samuel said the bells were broken, something creaked in the wind. The cathedral had waited so long for voices to fill its silence. Now it had them, one man and 3 children, carrying nothing but hope and the determination to make a life in a place the world had forgotten. But in houses of God, as Father Thomas would soon learn, not all prayers are answered the way we expect them to be. October came to Millbrook County like a gentle thief, stealing the green from the leaves and painting the mountains in shades of rust and gold. 3 weeks had passed since Father Thomas and the children had made St. Catherine's their home, and already the place felt different, warmer, somehow, despite the chill that crept through the stone walls each morning. The cathedral had revealed its secrets slowly. Behind the altar, they found the priest's quarters, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, 2 bedrooms barely large enough for beds, and a study lined with books whose pages smelled of old prayers. Father O'Malley had left everything behind, his clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, his reading glasses folded on the desk beside an unfinished letter that began, "My dear Bishop," and ended nowhere. Mary had claimed the kitchen as her domain. Each morning, she would rise before dawn and light the stove, her small hands careful with the matches. The sound of her bare feet on the cold stones had become Father Thomas's favorite way to wake. She would hum quietly as she worked, old hymns her mother had taught her, and the melody would drift through the cathedral like incense. "Father Thomas," she said one morning, standing in the doorway of his room with flour dusting her apron. "The bread is ready." He found her in the kitchen, pulling loaves from the oven with a confidence that broke his heart. She was 10 years old and already understood the weight of keeping a family fed. The bread was dense and dark, made from the last of their supplies, but it filled the small room with warmth and the promise of another day survived. Samuel and James burst through the kitchen door, their cheeks red from the cold morning air. They had been exploring the bell tower again, despite Thomas's gentle warnings to stay away from the upper reaches of the cathedral. Samuel clutched something in his small fist. "Look what we found," he said, opening his hand to reveal a small brass bell, no bigger than his palm. The metal was green with age, and when he shook it, it made no sound. "The clapper's missing," James explained, his dark eyes serious. "Sam says all the big bells are broken the same way." Thomas took the small bell and turned it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was beautiful, delicate scrollwork around the rim and a tiny angel carved into the bronze. But James was right. Without the clapper, it was just a hollow shell, unable to fulfill its purpose. "Maybe we can fix them," Mary said, setting the warm bread on the table. "Maybe that's why we're here." Through the kitchen window, Thomas could see down into the valley where the town of Millbrook huddled around the coal mine. From this distance, it looked like a collection of toys scattered by a careless child. But he knew that every day, more families loaded their belongings into wagons and left. The mine was playing out, the coal company was pulling back, and the town was slowly bleeding away. Yesterday, he had walked down the mountain road to buy supplies from Henderson's store. The old man had looked at him with eyes full of questions he was too polite to ask. "You're still up at the cathedral," Henderson had said, weighing out flour and salt. "Folks been wondering." "The children need a home," Thomas had replied, though he knew it wasn't the whole truth. They all needed this place, needed its silence and stone protection from a world that seemed to be crumbling around them. Coal company men been asking questions. Henderson had continued, his voice carefully neutral. About who owns what up there. About who's got rights to the land. Thomas had felt something cold settle in his stomach. The cathedral had been built with coal money, back when the valley was rich and the future seemed bright as polished brass. But ownership was a complicated thing when the world was changing so fast that yesterday's documents felt like ancient history. Now, watching the children eat their breakfast in the warm kitchen, he tried to push those worries aside. Samuel had found a piece of charcoal somewhere and was drawing on the back of an old envelope. Not the stick figures most 6-year-olds made, but careful, detailed sketches of the cathedral's architecture, complete with the broken bells in the tower. "How do you know what they look like?" Thomas asked, studying the boy's drawings. Samuel looked up with those dark eyes that seemed older than his years. "I can hear them," he said simply. "Even broken, they remember their songs." Mary paused in her clearing of the breakfast dishes. "Sometimes I hear them too," she admitted quietly. "Late at night, when the wind blows through the tower. It's like they're trying to ring, but they can't quite manage it." James nodded solemnly. "They're sad," he said. "The bells are sad because they can't call people to prayer anymore." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. The children had adapted to this place with an ease that both comforted and unsettled him. They moved through the cathedral as if they had always belonged here, as if the stones themselves recognized them as rightful inhabitants. After breakfast, they settled into their daily routines. Mary tended the altar candles, replacing the ones that had burned down overnight and polishing the brass holders until they gleamed. The boys disappeared into the nave, their footsteps echoing as they played games that seemed to involve long conversations with invisible companions. Thomas retreated to the study to work on his correspondence. He had been trying for weeks to contact the diocese, to explain their situation and request official permission to remain. But his letters seemed to disappear into silence, and he was beginning to wonder if the outside world had simply forgotten that St. Catherine's existed. From the study window, he could see the road that wound down the mountain toward town. A wagon was making its way up the slope, drawn by 2 tired horses. As it came closer, Thomas recognized the driver. Henderson from the general store, his face grim beneath his wool cap. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the cathedral, and Henderson climbed down slowly, as if his bones ached. Behind him the wagon bed, Thomas could see supplies, flour, salt, dried beans, and other necessities. "Mr. Henderson," Thomas called, stepping out to meet him. "This is unexpected." The old man's face was troubled. "Father, I thought you should know. The coal company men were in town again yesterday. They're buying up properties, making offers folks can't refuse. And they've been asking particular questions about the cathedral." Thomas felt his heart sink, but he kept his voice steady. "What sort of questions?" "About who's living here. About whether the church still has legal claim to the land." Henderson hefted a bag of flour from the wagon. "I figured you might need supplies, what with winter coming on, and the children to think about." They worked in silence, carrying the provisions into the cathedral. The old man's generosity touched Thomas deeply, but also highlighted how precarious their situation truly was. They were living on borrowed time, in a place that might not legally be theirs, surviving on the kindness of neighbors who were themselves preparing to leave. As Henderson prepared to depart, he paused at the cathedral doors. "Father," he said quietly, "whatever's coming, those children are lucky to have you. Don't let nobody tell you different." After the wagon disappeared down the mountain road, Thomas stood in the doorway and listened to the sounds of his makeshift family echoing through the stone halls. Mary's humming from the kitchen, the boys' laughter from somewhere in the nave, the whisper of wind through the broken bells high above. He had enough supplies now to last them through the worst of winter if they were careful. But supplies wouldn't protect them from men with legal documents and the power to enforce them. And as he watched the last leaves falling from the trees that lined the mountain road, Father Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful days in the cathedral were numbered, counted out like coins from a dwindling purse. November 1863. The notice came with the dawn, nailed to the cathedral doors like a declaration of war against hope itself. Father Thomas found it when he stepped outside to collect firewood, the parchment crackling in the cold mountain air. The words were official, stamped with the seal of the Millbrook Coal Company. All residents must vacate the premises by sunset, November 15th. No exceptions. Today was November 10th. Thomas's hands shook as he read the document again, as if the words might change if he stared at them long enough. Behind him, the cathedral doors stood open, and he could hear Mary's voice drifting out. She was teaching the boys a hymn their mother had sung, her clear voice carrying the melody while their smaller voices tried to follow. The sound broke his heart and strengthened his resolve at the same time. He folded the notice and slipped it into his coat pocket. The children didn't need to see it yet. They had already lost one home to fire. He wouldn't let fear steal this moment of peace from them. But peace, Thomas was learning, was a fragile thing in a world that seemed determined to crush it. By mid-morning, the mountain road was busy with wagons. From the cathedral steps, Thomas watched the exodus begin. The Henderson family loaded their possessions into an old freight wagon, their faces grim with the resignation of people who had fought this battle too many times before. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house walked alongside her wagon, leading the milk cow that had been her livelihood. The Kowalski boys drove their father's wagon, piled high with mining equipment and the few pieces of furniture they couldn't bear to leave behind. Each departure felt like a small death. Mary appeared beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Where is everyone going, Father Thomas?" He put his arm around her shoulders, feeling how small she was beneath the worn fabric of her dress. "To find new homes, child. New places to start over." "But why?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "This is their home." Thomas didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 10-year-old girl who had already seen too much loss. Instead, he held her closer and watched as another wagon disappeared around the bend in the road. That afternoon, Henderson made one last trip up to the cathedral. His wagon was loaded with everything Thomas had feared it would be: his family, their belongings, and the weight of goodbye. The old man climbed down slowly, his face carved with lines that seemed deeper than they had been just days before. "Father," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've come to say farewell." Thomas stepped forward, the children gathering behind him like chicks seeking shelter. "Mr. Henderson, now don't you start making speeches," Henderson interrupted, but his tone was gentle. "We both know what you're planning to do, and we both know I can't talk you out of it." From his wagon, Henderson pulled a canvas sack that clinked softly when he moved it. "Supplies," he said gruffly. "Enough to see you through the winter, if you're careful. And some other things you might need." Thomas accepted the sack, feeling the weight of coins among the supplies. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Henderson's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Someone has to remember this place the way it was. Someone has to keep the faith burning when the rest of us are too afraid to hold the candle." The old man knelt down to the children's level, his voice growing softer. "Mary, you take care of that priest of yours. And boys," he looked at Samuel and James with the gravity of someone passing on sacred knowledge, "you keep listening to those bells. Even broken things can make beautiful music if you know how to hear it." After Henderson's wagon disappeared down the mountain road, the silence seemed to press in around them like deep water. Thomas stood in the cathedral doorway, watching the last of the daylight fade from the valley below. The town of Millbrook looked like a collection of abandoned dolls' houses, windows dark and chimneys cold. They were alone now. That evening, as the children slept in their beds in the priest's quarters, Thomas sat in the study and stared at the notice he had removed from the cathedral door. Tomorrow, men would come. They would have legal documents and the power to enforce them. They would expect to find the cathedral empty, ready for whatever fate the coal company had planned. Instead, they would find a priest and 3 orphan children who had nowhere else to go. Thomas folded the notice and placed it in the desk drawer next to Father O'Malley's unfinished letter. Then he walked through the cathedral, checking the doors, banking the fires, preparing for what might be their last night of peace. In the nave, moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in patterns of blue and gold. Thomas knelt before the altar and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself listening to the silence, the vast, breathing quiet of a place that had been abandoned by the world but not by faith. Somewhere above him, in the bell tower, the wind moved through the broken bells. It made no music, just the hollow whisper of air through empty bronze shells. But Samuel was right. If you listened carefully, you could almost hear the ghost of their old songs. Wednesday morning dawned gray and cold, with the smell of snow in the air. Thomas woke to find Mary already in the kitchen, making breakfast as if this were any other day. The boys were at the table, drawing with pieces of charcoal on scraps of paper. Their pictures showed the cathedral as it might have been. Bells ringing, people filling the pews, lights streaming through whole windows instead of cracked glass. "They're coming today, aren't they?" Mary asked quietly, not looking up from the stove. Thomas nodded. There was no point in pretending anymore. "Good," she said, and the certainty in her voice surprised him. "I want them to see that we belong here." The sound of horses reached them before noon. A dozen riders coming up the mountain road, led by a man in a black coat and hat. Thomas watched from the window as they approached, their faces grim with the unpleasant duty they had come to perform. He met them at the cathedral doors, the children standing behind him in a line. Mary held the boys' hands, her chin raised with the fierce dignity of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to be afraid of losing it again. The man in the black coat dismounted and approached, legal documents folded in his gloved hands. "Father McKenna, I presume? I'm William Thornton, representing the Millbrook Coal Company. I'm here to enforce the evacuation order. I received your notice, Mr. Thornton," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "But as you can see, we have chosen to remain." Thornton's eyes moved over the children, and Thomas saw something flicker in his expression. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition of what he was being asked to do. "Father, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. The company has legal claim to this land. These buildings will be demolished to make way for expanded mining operations. This is a house of God, Mr. Thornton, and these children have no other home. The law doesn't recognize sentiment, Father. You have until sunset to gather your belongings and leave peacefully. After that, we'll be forced to remove you." Thornton remounted his horse and led his men back down the mountain road, leaving Thomas and the children standing in the doorway of their sanctuary. The silence that followed felt different now, charged with the electricity of an approaching storm. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Thomas gathered the children in the nave. They knelt together before the altar, not in prayer, but in simple communion with the place that had become their whole world. Outside, the sound of approaching horses echoed off the stone walls, growing louder with each passing moment. But inside the cathedral, in the circle of their small family, there was only the steady rhythm of 4 hearts beating in defiance of a world that had forgotten how to make room for love. The first snow came that same night, as if the sky itself were weeping for what was about to be lost. Father Thomas woke to silence, so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. No sound of horses, no voices of men with legal papers and hard faces. Just the soft whisper of snow falling against the stained glass windows, each flake catching the moonlight like a tiny prayer made visible. He rose from his narrow bed and walked to the window. The valley below lay buried under a white blanket so thick and perfect that it seemed to erase the very idea that people had ever lived there. The abandoned houses of Millbrook were now just gentle mounds beneath the snow, their stories written in a language only the mountain could read. Thornton and his men were gone. Whether they had retreated to wait out the storm or simply given up, Thomas didn't know. He only knew that for now, in this moment stolen from time itself, they were safe. In the kitchen, he found Mary already awake, standing at the window with her breath fogging the glass. She traced patterns in the condensation with her finger, circles and spirals that looked like the rose windows of the cathedral. "It's beautiful," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell the snow had cast over their world. "Yes," Thomas agreed, putting his hand on her shoulder. "Beautiful and dangerous. We're truly alone now, child." She looked up at him with those eyes that had seen too much and somehow remained clear as spring water. "We were always alone, Father Thomas. But we were alone together. That's different." The boys appeared in the doorway, Samuel carrying his collection of broken bell pieces and James rubbing sleep from his dark eyes. They had grown quieter in recent weeks, as if they understood without being told that their voices were the only ones left to fill the cathedral's vast spaces. "The bells," Samuel said suddenly, his small face bright with discovery. "They're singing now. Can you hear them?" Thomas listened, straining his ears against the silence. At first, he heard nothing but the whisper of snow and the soft breathing of the children. But then, carried on the wind that moved through the bell tower, came something else. Not quite music, but not quite silence either. A resonance, as if the broken bells were remembering their songs and dreams. "I hear it," James said softly. "It sounds like people praying." And it did. The wind through the damaged bronze created harmonies that rose and fell like the murmur of a congregation, like the voices of all the people who had ever worshipped in this place, layered one upon another until they became something larger than any individual prayer. That morning, they began their new life in earnest. With the outside world buried under snow and the coal company men nowhere to be seen, they settled into routines that felt both ancient and timeless. Mary took charge of their dwindling supplies, portioning out flour and salt with the careful precision of someone who understood that waste meant hunger. The boys explored every corner of the cathedral, mapping its secrets like cartographers of the sacred. Thomas found Father O'Malley's books in the study and began teaching the children from them. Not just reading and arithmetic, but Latin and theology, music theory, and the names of saints. Their classroom was the nave itself, their desks the worn wooden pews, their blackboard the smooth stone walls where centuries of candlelight had written stories in soot and shadow. "Tell us about St. Catherine," Mary asked one afternoon as they sat before the altar, sharing a simple meal of bread and preserved pears. "The one the cathedral is named for." Thomas smiled, remembering the story from his own childhood. "She was very young, like you, and very brave. When the Roman emperor tried to make her worship false gods, she refused. She knew that some things are worth standing firm for, even when the whole world tells you to bend." "What happened to her?" Samuel asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. "She died for what she believed in," Thomas said gently. "But her death wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of her legend." The children considered this in the way that children do, accepting the mystery of sacrifice without needing to fully understand it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding another layer to their isolation and another day to their borrowed time. December passed like a dream. They celebrated Christmas with carols sung to empty pews and a feast made from their carefully hoarded supplies. Thomas fashioned gifts from scraps and imagination. Dolls made from altar cloth for Mary, wooden toys carved from broken pew boards for the boys. The children gave him pictures they had drawn with charcoal, showing the cathedral as it lived in their hearts. Whole, shining, filled with light and music and the promise of forever. On New Year's Eve, they gathered in the bell tower. It was the first time Thomas had climbed the narrow stone steps since their arrival, and what he found there took his breath away. The bells themselves were magnificent even in their brokenness. Massive bronze giants suspended from oak beams that had stood for decades. Their clappers had indeed been removed, but the bells themselves sang anyway, responding to every gust of wind with whispers and echoes that seemed to carry the voices of angels. "This is where we belong," Mary said, her words barely audible above the wind. "This is where we've always belonged." Thomas looked out over the snow-covered valley, at the buried town and the abandoned roads, at the world that had moved on without them. He felt no sadness, only a deep peace that settled in his bones like the warmth of a long-awaited homecoming. January brought fresh snow and deeper silence. Their supplies dwindled, but somehow there was always enough. A sack of grain would last longer than it should have. A jar of preserves would feed them for days when it should have lasted hours. Thomas chose not to question these small miracles, accepting them as he had learned to accept so much else, with gratitude and wonder. The children grew taller and quieter, their faces taking on the serene quality of the stone saints that watched over them. They moved through the cathedral like young priests and priestesses, tending candles that never seemed to burn out, cleaning floors that somehow stayed spotless, maintaining a sanctuary that needed no maintenance because it was sustained by something beyond physical laws. February brought the deepest cold any of them had ever felt, but inside the cathedral they were warm. The stones themselves seemed to generate heat, as if the prayers of generations had built up in the walls like spiritual insulation. They wore their coats out of habit rather than necessity, and often Thomas would find them sleeping peacefully without covers, as if the cathedral itself were a blanket wrapped around their dreams. March came with the first hints of spring, but no sign of the outside world returning to claim them. The snow began to melt, revealing foundations where houses had once stood, but no new buildings rose to replace them. The mountain road remained empty, overgrown with grass and wildflowers that seemed to have sprouted overnight. It was on a warm April morning that Thomas realized the truth. He was standing at the kitchen window, watching Mary teach the boys to plant a garden in the rich soil beside the cathedral, when he noticed that their shadows fell differently than they should have. The sunlight passed through them, as if they were made of the same stained glass that colored the cathedral floors. He looked down at his own hands and saw them clearly, solid and real. But when he held them up to the light, he could see the faint outline of the window frame through his palm. They were becoming part of the cathedral, becoming part of the story that would outlive them all. That evening, as they gathered for their simple supper, Thomas told the children what he had discovered. They listened with the calm acceptance they had learned from months of miracles, as if this were simply the next chapter in a story they had always known by heart. "Are we dying, Father Thomas?" Mary asked, her voice curious rather than afraid. "No, child," he said, taking her hand and finding it warm and real and precious. "We're becoming something else, something that can't be moved or demolished or forgotten. We're becoming part of the mountain's memory." The years that followed, though time itself seemed to lose meaning in that place, were filled with quiet joy. They watched seasons change through windows that grew more transparent with each passing month. They tended gardens that bloomed without seed and sang songs that echoed long after their voices had faded into whispers. Sometimes hikers would find the ruins years later, foundations overgrown with mountain laurel, broken stones that might once have been walls. They would wonder about the people who had lived there, about the stories the silent stones remembered. But the mountain knew. The mountain remembered a priest and 3 children who had loved a place so deeply that they chose to become part of it rather than leave it behind. On quiet nights, when the wind moved through the trees that grew where the cathedral once stood, you could still hear the ghost of bells ringing, still catch the echo of laughter that had filled rooms now returned to forest. And sometimes, if you knew how to listen, you could hear them still, a small family that had found forever in the space between one breath and the next, in the choice to stay when everyone else had gone.